Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. This is the, I guess, second edition of Drezburt. I'm Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts and a contributing editor of Foreign Policy magazine.
And I'm Heather Hurlburt, and I'm a senior fellow at Human Rights First. And not to let our fans down, Dan Drezner, let's start with our Harold Ramis theory of international relations in homage to the late, great comic and writer. And I'm going to start by arguing that international coalitions are, as I said on Twitter, a lot more like Ghostbusters than you would like to think in terms of the frequent lack of consistency between plans and reality.
Okay, go for it.
Also, the sort of fantastical quality of the way one's opponents are conceived. And, you know, one of these days when the Pentagon gets a little further along with its research on non-lethal weapons, there'll be slime.
I would, if I'm going to, I would say two things on this. Three things. First, I've actually been genuinely touched at the extent to which people miss Harold Ramis. I mean, I don't think, at least for your and my generation, he really was our comedy lodestar in a lot of ways. He sort of formed a lot of the instincts of what was funny. And as I said on Twitter yesterday, at some point, I really do want to be able to say, apropos of Ghostbusters, back off, man. I'm an international relations theorist. That probably won't ever happen, though. But I will say the optimist in me will think that the foreign policy implications of his oeuvre can hopefully be best found in Groundhog Day. Because Groundhog Day might be the best example in a movie I can think of demonstrating learning over time. Because in some ways, Phil Connors gets to actually conduct randomized control trials of what he should do in his life because he gets to repeat it over and over and over and over again. And would that only we had that technology for international relations.
Well, that raises an article that you wrote recently, sort of criticizing Nick Kristof for criticizing the Academy. And your Groundhog Day analogy would seem to suggest that there is actually a role for randomized trials and learning in real life and policy formation.
I would certainly go there. So, yeah, this all started about 10 days ago when Kristof wrote his column for the Sunday New York Times, basically bemoaning the fact that, in his opinion, professors were far too cloistered in the academy and they weren't having any kind of real-world impact, particularly talking about the social sciences, political science, sociology, anthropology, and why weren't any of them as influential as economists. This prompted some blowback, I would say, from both me but also a whole bunch of colleagues, basically pointing out, where have you been for the last decade, actually, while certainly that criticism has, perhaps a germ of truth to it, has always had a germ of truth to it. The situation is much better now than it was a decade ago. And so, my favorite, I think the way you can sum it up was there was a Monkey Cage post, I think, that basically said, hey, Nick Kristof, we're right here. And what's interesting to me is the extent to which you really saw a division between those people like, let's say, Richard Haass or David Rothkopf, basically agreeing with Kristof, and a whole bunch of academics disagreeing with him, myself included. And here I will give Nick considerable credit because I do think he was at least willing to engage his critics online in a way that, frankly, couldn't have happened 10 years ago.
Yeah, I actually had a very interesting discussion on this with a group of senior women think tank types, all sort of agonizing about what the role of blogging and Twitter in their lives should be. And I was struck by the extent to which this conversation is happening at different speeds among different generations. And where I think folks that are more at the beginning of their careers and partly have less to lose and also partly the world has always been like this, don't have the level of anxiety that, somebody, the interesting thing is if you're 50, say, and you are, at a think tank or in a senior academic job or coming out of government or aspiring to go into government, one of the things you think about is how can I engage in a way that Nick Kristof and Richard Haass will still take me seriously, and will Richard Haass take me seriously if I have a Twitter account? Not to pick on Richard in particular, but
who has a Twitter account? Let me add, so
yeah. And I have no idea. I will just say I assume that Richard writes his own tweets. He's certainly smart and funny enough to write his own tweets. But there is, among us older folks, there is a very real sort of gatekeeper issue of, what do your peers think of you? Are you still a serious substantive person, or are you just a popularizer? On the other hand, I mean, these media are how you easily reach either policymakers or the gatekeepers of policymakers. Because, who controls who decides what goes into the New York Times op-eds? Where does Nick Kristof get his ideas for columns? Mm-hmm. If you're an academic, how do you reach Nick Kristof getting his ideas for columns? Hint, it's not peer-reviewed journals.
That's very true. I would say a few things on this. First, I think there's a reason. There's an additional reason why the generation gap on this is distinct. Partly, as you say, it's because if you're just coming into this, you've lived in a world of blogs and social media, so why would you not do these things? But I also think, frankly, I think it's harder for people with, for lack of a better way of putting it, establishment reputations that already have brands to then try to venture out into this sort of new terrain. Because the fact is the risks of screwing up are greater. So, speaking from the academic side, when I started blogging or tweeting or what have you, I was at a much lower level than, let's say, if Bob Cohane were to decide to do that. And so as a result, if I screwed up, the downside risks weren't as great potentially than if Bob Cohane does it, at least in terms of, reputation or possibility for mockery and so forth. So in that sense, I think you're right. I think a more interesting point, and this was a point I made in my Politico magazine response to Kristof, is this notion about popularizing and about the rewards for it. At least I don't know about the think tank world, but I can certainly say in the academy, one of the points I was trying to make, and here I think Kristof has a sort of semi-valid point. I think the biggest contribution sometimes that academics can make to policy debates is pointing out what to academics is at least the blinding glimpse of the obvious, but is apparently not so inside the DC world. The problem is that the academic rewards for writing those things are not that great because you are seen, as you said, as a popularizer. And so in some ways, I think that's an issue that also does need to be addressed.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, Dan, we should note here that you actually did pay a fairly significant price, at least a temporary one, for being one of the blogging pioneers in international relations. And I was bemused talking to a group of younger folks recently that people were very aware of you in our field, and none of them were aware that your early blogging was not without its controversy as to whether it befitted someone of the stature you were desirous of obtaining. And they all looked at me and said, really? Somebody thought blogging and tenure didn't go together? So I just paused to note, sort of number one, the world has really changed. Yeah. And number two, it hasn't been that long.
Right. No. And in some way, I mean, live this way. When I can say the world has changed, I speak from experience here. So, that is why I think it's worth pointing out. And that's why it was frustrating to see that column, because there was a lack of awareness in the ways in which the world has changed. And I think in some ways the very fact that Kristof had to engage with his critics shows how things have changed. So that's a move for the better. But I will also say that I found it interesting, your discussion of the sort of agonizing, and it sounds like you said you were talking mostly among female think tankers, because this is a nice segue to another issue, which is this Rosa Brooks response to Sheryl Sandberg, on foreign policy, which I take it you have read as well.
Yes, well, it's a fascinating thing, and I should point out here that that Rosa and Sheryl were actually classmates at Harvard,
which Rosa mentions in the piece.
Yes, and so there has been already an attempt to say, Rosa's the new anti-Sheryl, and I don't think Rosa sees it that way. Yeah. And again, I mean, the fascinating thing is, tenured Georgetown law professor, fellow at New America, served in 2 administrations, on the board of the Open Society Foundations. Not exactly a slacker.
Right. Yes.
And I should say Rosa's a friend, so I'm quite biased here. But many of us would love for that to be our slacking off resume. But what I think she says she's been surprised by. So what she says is she has the Recline Manifesto, which is basically decline to work 100-hour weeks and say no, you can't be perfect at 2 24/7 jobs. You can't. Nobody can have a career which they're expected to attend to 24/7 and be a 24/7 parent, as parents and women in particular are now sort of expected to be. And I think she's been surprised what a chord this strikes. And, sort of on the positive side, it's wonderful that it strikes such a chord. But the other thing that's fascinating is, Rosa writes really serious stuff about human rights, about civil-military relations, about future shape of our defense establishment. And what does she get the most attention for, this piece? So,
yeah.
On the one hand, it's fabulous that it's getting attention. And as somebody who, has made no bones about saying that I work damn hard and there are limits to how damn hard I will work, which is probably why I'm sitting in my dining room talking to you on Blogging Heads. But also just that we love to talk about this stuff, and then how often does that actually translate into changing the culture in ways that make it more humane for anybody?
Well, I would say a few things with this. First, I liked Rosa's piece. I would also like to say, for the record, the only thing I hate Sheryl Sandberg for is, in fact, her spectacular hair. I was very amused by that part of the piece. But, on the one hand, I certainly have some sympathy. And in some ways, I actually think Rosa touches on a deeper point, which is not just about women. I'll get to that in a second, but more about this culture, particularly in D.C. And I seriously blame the West Wing for part of this. But only part of it, is this notion that you're not working unless you're at your desk until 10 o'clock at night, that you're not working hard unless you're putting in the hours.
I hate to tell you it was like that before the West Wing.
Right. No, I grant you that. But I think in some ways the West Wing kind of reified it, and then successive generations thought, well, that's how it has to be. But I really had a problem with this notion of you're not working hard unless you're there until 10 o'clock at night and get in before the janitor is there at like 6 in the morning. Which God knows there are days where that might have to happen, particularly in a foreign, in a real-time foreign policy world. But having worked in government, and maybe you can correct me, I actually thought that that's not always the case. And in fact, it's sometimes far healthier to that culture is a dangerous one, precisely because it leads to this insanity of spending all your time at work, when in fact, there's actually diminishing marginal returns to the extra minute you're there, potentially.
So three things about that from my experience. And the first thing is just to say, I was in government before 9/11, and this is all much, much worse since 9/11.
Right. No, I was also before 9/11 as well. So yeah.
So that's sort of point one.
Right.
Point two is that Washington is a very competitive place. And in the same way that, competition in elite academic environments sometimes leads to things like stealing the books from the library, cutting the pages out, this is a way that people compete and show their devotion and dedication. And I think also, and this, by the way, is something that totally, there's a lot of sort of class arguments that get made about, well, who can even contemplate reclining.
Yeah,
but a piece of this which appears in these rarefied environments just the same as it appears on an assembly line is pure and simple control. Is that you want to know where your people are. You want to know that they're working. You were hazed and you worked like crap on your way up. And if you're suffering, you want to know that everybody that works for you is suffering just as much. And that's a very unattractive trait, but it's a very human trait. And like I say, you see it absolutely everywhere. So,
I guess my quick response to that point is that, just like in medicine, for example, where, there used to be these incredibly brutal, internships and residencies in terms of the hours they were expected to put in and the length of shifts that they would have to do, like 36-hour shifts where they're awake the whole time, which actually leads to bad medicine, I would argue. I think it's a win-win scenario to actually scale back on this culture, but I grant you the competitive aspect of it.
Yeah. Well, I think there's also a way that this relates to the point about sort of outside influence, which is that when you're all there from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., it becomes a more and more hermetically sealed environment.
Yes.
And it gets harder and harder for outsiders to penetrate. And I just think about, my colleagues and neighbors in this administration who the first year and a half I used to see socially. Right. And their ability to sort of socialize outside the office or make it to events has really trailed off over time. And you just kind of get into this hermetically sealed culture and other ideas don't penetrate, and you kind of wear down your stock of intellectual capital after a while, and you need to get out to replenish it.
This is a recurring theme I have heard from anyone, regardless of party, when they serve in an administration. Yeah. The one thing I was going to ask you, though, is interesting, is that, one of the ways which you dealt with this was that traditionally, at least in my memory, people at our level or lower who would go into an administration like at the NSC or state or what have you, usually you're talking about 18 to 24 months, and then they would leave, precisely for all the burnout reasons you've talked about. I mean, do you think the duration has gotten longer, which is also a problem?
No, if anything, I think there's in this administration, I see two distinct categories of people. And I'm not sure what it was like in the George W. Bush administration. It'd be an interesting question. But there's definitely a category of people who say, I went in for 18 to 24 months, I loved every minute, and I'm completely exhausted, my kids don't know me, I got to get out now. And then there's the category of people who are just absolutely not interested in going anywhere, or who are finally now going somewhere after 6 years. So you've kind of got a pretty stark divide between the people that are going to be there until they get kicked out on January 20th, 2017, and the people who've looked around at 24 months and said, "Whoa, I gotta move on."
Yeah. But there is one other thing I would say about Rosa's piece, which I tweeted about earlier, and this is, I'll say this and then I want to defer to you because to some extent it's about the gender question, which is, Rosa was framing it as this whole Sheryl Sandberg, Anne-Marie Slaughter debate about having it all. And, her point was that Sandberg's book, leads to all these anxieties about, is she as a player, for lack of a way of putting it, really leaning in that much when actually what she wants to do is be with her kids more. Now, I will grant you that maybe Sandberg's book instills that kind of anxiety. But I also kept thinking, on the whole balance of scales things in terms of sort of work-life balance, what's worse? One Sheryl Sandberg book in which she argues women need to lean in, as a way to sort of trailblaze and so forth, or every parenting tome ever written telling you as a parent that you are doing it wrong. Because I would argue that in some ways the anxiety produced on the parenting side of things is galactically worse than anything Sheryl Sandberg wrote. And so in some ways I want to see a parallel piece about reclining in parenting.
Well, I will say, as someone who has been subject both to you're a bad mommy if your child is not physically attached to you 24 hours a day, and you're failing as a fortunate, educated person if you're not, national security advisor already.
Right.
I don't think it's useful to say one is worse than the other. I do agree with you on the parenting side, and it's clearly coming from the same place that this culture has, for its upper middle class, highly educated aspirant, to develop this ridiculous performative quality. Yes. And it's much more about performance than it is about either the goal of having a healthy, well-adjusted child, or having a healthy, well-adjusted national security policy, or whatever your policy is. That we've lost, or we're detaching performance from outcomes, if you will.
No, I agree with that. And again, it's not that I necessarily disagreed with anything that Rosa was saying, but in some ways she actually talked in the column about how she felt this anxiety of needing to spend more time with the kids. Now, if you're at a nonstop, job in D.C., forget the parenting manuals. You obviously want to spend more time with your kids. But this sort of anxiety that, particularly with the milieu we're talking about, I think in some ways is even more powerful with parenting than it is with the career thing. And so all I want to say is I agree with you. I like the whole idea of sort of general. I think Rosa needs to be more ambitious. We need to talk about reclining on a global scale.
Well, okay, but then I'll say one last thing is that it's interesting because as women, we're allowed to say, oh, we should recline more in the professional sphere. And that's kind of okay because everybody suspected us of having divided loyalties anyway. It's actually much more powerful for you to say that we need to recline in the parenting sphere because that lets us off the hook. Because in the parenting sphere, we might be saying it just because, we don't have enough maternal instinct because we're all like deformed killer career women anyway.
Oh, you see, now this is interesting because I actually thought it would be more powerful coming from women because I assume me saying it, the response is, yeah, well, that's because he's a dad, so he has that option of reclining because, presumably that just means the mom's going to step up or something more.
But see, that's why, I feel like
which is not what I'm saying is what's happening, by the way. I'm just,
No, but I'm consulting right now, and I do not have I have several, again, it's, it doesn't look like leaning out at all. I have several sort of very serious, interesting jobs. I'm publishing a lot, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't look like reclining anywhere except in Washington, D.C., where it looks like I'm flat on my back with sunscreen. Yeah, I mean, where, having 3 different senior advisor fellow roles and publishing, and going and sort of leading seminars at the Council on Foreign Relations, only in Washington, D.C. does that look like, going to the beach.
Yeah, I was going to say.
But it does look like going to the beach. But then if I say, well, my mom just had surgery and my son, blah, 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 then it's like, oh, of course. And, I don't feel like, well, I do have anxiety about what I've foreclosed, but I feel like I can probably manage it. And in the same way, a guy can say, yeah, the parenting culture is out of control. And the guy, there's just a little bit less question of maybe you're just saying that because you're not good at it.
Oh, I see. Fair enough. Okay. No, but yes, as a guy, I will say it's out of control. It's insane. We need to scale back.
So yeah, how about you write the Recline in Parenting manifesto? The other thing is also I have only one child, so I'm a massive slacker on the parenting front already.
Well, I can't respect you now. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
As a 2-child, I've got a 2-child ante. You need at least a 2-child ante for this game.
Right.
But I will consider writing that. But we should move from talking about the byways of the foreign policy community to actual foreign policy.
Yes. So let's return to Harold Ramis for a minute, because when we were having this exchange on sort of what is the Harold Ramis doctrine, I started thinking about Mr. Stay Puft. And then I started thinking about efforts to reform the Pentagon budget and Mr. Stay Puft. And
I'm really looking forward to seeing where this goes.
Yes. So Secretary Hagel and the chiefs were up on the Hill on Monday previewing the Pentagon budget that will be released next week. And it performs the twin achievements of proposing that the U.S. spend much more money on the Pentagon than is foreseen under sequester, and thus challenging Congress to fix itself and not go back to what's foreseen in the coming years. And at the same time, cutting the Army to its lowest level since before World War II, proposing modest pension and benefit reforms, which still leave the military a much better deal than anything you get in civilian life, but have outraged veterans groups and getting rid of some of our older weapons systems. So at once, assuming that they get more money than they were going to get, and managing to cut enough stuff to really outrage some of the Iron Rice Bowl folks. So, and one of the things that was said about this was this budget takes our country off of war footing, and that's a really interesting moment to be at.
I would agree. What will be interesting to see is what the public reaction to this is. I mean, I don't doubt your point about veterans groups being upset, but it is striking that this is occurring during a foreign policy moment, or at least a public mood moment, where there is, let's just say, decided reluctance to even contemplate any kind of ambitious or even not so ambitious use of military force elsewhere. So I suspect that the public reaction to this is going to be relatively copacetic. Whether that translates into congressional support is a separate thing entirely. I think the other thing that's going to be fascinating going forward, and there was a piece written for Foreign Policy on this, is whether the chiefs are as behind this strategy as Hagel is, particularly Odierno. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah. Yes. And Odierno is the one whose ox really got gored here, because you'll notice that the Army takes the cuts, the Marines do not.
Right.
So no, Odierno is going to be sort of out there on his own. But at the same time, all the chiefs, and I've sat in small groups with some of them recently, the specter of, as somebody put it, being a benefits society that occasionally fires a drone, has all of them really unnerved. And Dempsey, the chairman, has said, look, we need to do this. We need to do it once. We need to not drag it out. We need to give our people predictability. And so they want to do this and get it over with. I think even more than they want not. Now that, I think, is the one thing that's not possible.
Yeah, that's just not going to happen.
Yeah, no, this year is the opening salvo, and
Right.
there'll be lots of fights about it, and maybe some more pieces of it will happen next year, which, from a predictability point of view is kind of disastrous, but that seems to be where we are as a style of governance.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I mean, partially this goes back on conversations we've had before about the sort of changing partisan coalitions when it comes to foreign policy. Because one of the obvious questions is, how does the Republican, how does the GOP react to this? Traditionally, they've obviously been the hawkish party, but I can see an increasing number of Republicans that might be totally on board with this proposal, which would potentially make it easier to grease the wheels. I guess the other question you want to ask is, there's been the fact that I didn't pay that much attention to this budget, until we were going to talk about it. And, so as someone who was not a terribly active seeker of news, the one data point that came into my consciousness was Army proposed to be lower than World War II for the first time, which is going to be the standout point. And the question is that going to lead to any kind of, for lack of a better putting it, pundit hysteria on this question?
Well, it's absolutely going to lead to pundit hysteria. And then the interesting question is, what's the conversation after that? Because, who is it or what is it that you want to use a 500,000 standing army against? As if we all agree, and
because this is taking place at the exact same time that President Obama has basically made it clear to Hamid Karzai, we're getting out of Afghanistan. We're just not going to wait for you to prevaricate further on this. Maybe there'll be a residual force with your successor, but in some ways that completes in some ways the sort of grand aspect of the Barack Obama's foreign policy vision, which was to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan.
Right, and just as has been said over and over by just about everyone except the neocon wing of the Republican Party, which controls very few seats in Congress, frankly. Yeah. Nobody is interested in doing large-scale stability operations, large-scale, nobody thinks that the U.S. is going to occupy Syria. Also, nobody thinks that the U.S. is going to invade China, which is really just about the only thing you could imagine using, that much of a land army for.
Yeah.
So then the question becomes, okay, tell me what we would need it for. And if we can actually have that conversation, that'll be a very interesting moment. Now, I'm not sure, particularly in an election year, we can have that conversation. And just the last point to make is all politics is local here. Mm-hmm. And so partisanship, and you can point to interesting ideological divides in the Republican Party and more libertarian members who have actually been very active in pushing for reductions in Pentagon spending. But, if you're in the district where the littoral combat ship is being built, or if you're in one of the many, many, many districts where the F-35, the plane that ate the Pentagon, is being built, then, ideology and everything else go out the window. So, what the debate that's going to come is going to be very fragmented, hard for party leaderships to control. And in the end, really, the question is kind of not, will Congress get behind it? That's simple, it won't. But how much can you get Congress to accept of what the Pentagon is saying, hey, this is necessary?
No, I tend to agree. And I think it'll be an interesting, and as you point out, cross-cutting debate on this. I don't think that you're going to see necessarily sharp partisan divisions. And, the other thing I would point out, simply put, is that, I do hope the pundit hysteria bubble pops very quickly, and that we can then move forward and actually having a proper conversation on this, as opposed to this notion of the U.S. is in total retrench. There was some god-awful Richard Cohen op-ed yesterday or the day before, that basically arguing that there is splintering in Europe, and that's all because of a lack of U.S. leadership. That, if the U.S. was leading, Catalonia would not want to secede, which really just so stupid that I cannot begin to fathom the level of stupidity, which admittedly was my mistake for reading a Richard Cohen column in the first place. But still, that's the kind of mindset that I'm hoping a week from now we do not have to talk about.
So that's great. When Scotland has its referendum, and when the Scottish referendum fails because London said you will not be allowed to keep the pound if you secede, will that then be a tribute to U.S. leadership?
Oh, undoubtedly so.
Sarcastically.
Yes, exactly. That's clearly it's totally connected to U.S. military leadership. If the U.S. spends more, if the U.S. arrests this appalling decline in its military spending, finally Scotland will get its house in order.
Yeah, this is where you just really despair of the United States. And this, frankly, is a cross-ideological problem that you just kind of want to look at us and say, look, it's not always about you. Which brings us to Ukraine, actually, because I have been making, there's been a lot of, frankly, breathless commentary by people who just discovered Ukraine and just discovered that there's a divide between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers. And a lot of breathless, will Ukraine split in two? And I keep saying, look, one of the reasons Ukraine's not going to split in two is that neither the EU nor Russia really has a lot of interest in encouraging devolution like that.
Right. A devolution that, by the way, would be violent, inevitably.
Yes, and if you look at the demonstrations that are going on today, which, there are big, scary counter-demonstrations in Crimea, which folks will remember that Stalin gave as, quote-unquote, a gift to Ukraine, and it isn't historically Ukrainian. Yeah. But there are also counter demonstrations. So, it's not as simple as you could draw a line down the middle of the country and somehow make Kiev some kind of shared, like the Jerusalem of Eastern Europe, for heaven's sake.
I have to say, so my reaction to all this is like yours. Is first of all, a good tip for whether or not people have just discovered Ukraine is whether they say the Ukraine. If they say the Ukraine, if they use the, it's an indication they have no idea what the hell they're talking about. That or they're 90 years old. I privilege 80 years old or older foreign policy commentators who say the Ukraine. That's fine because that's the way it used to be talked about. But otherwise, it's a good tip-off. Like Rand Paul was talking about how he doesn't think the U.S. should play a large role in the Ukraine. And even if I was somewhat sympathetic with Rand Paul's observations about this, he made a comment basically saying, well, Ukraine has been in part of the Soviet Union or part of the Russian orbit for quite some time, so maybe we shouldn't get involved, which omits the fact that this isn't necessarily what the Ukrainians have wanted. But the thing that I've been more struck by in the debate about the last week is, and it ties back to the thing we were first talking about, is the total collective amnesia of people talking about this, forgetting that 10 years ago, basically, Ukraine underwent a very similar sort of style in terms of regime change, and it's worth remembering what happened after that, which is to say you had the Orange Revolution, you had, Yanukovych, who was supposed to become the president, lose, you had, all these Western Ukrainians, come to power, and not much happened in the end, which is which is not to therefore be pessimistic about this time around, but I guess my realistic assessment of what's going to happen in Ukraine is it's going to muddle through. It's what Ukraine has always done. Ukraine is big enough for both Russia and the European Union to care about. It's big enough for both Russia and the European Union and the United States to be interested in stability, which is why the readings that I've done about what happened in sort of Yanukovych's final days suggest that actually the Russians basically Yanukovych wanted the Russians to intervene militarily, and the Russians said, we're not going to do that, which is in no small part why Yanukovych leaves the scene. But basically, I don't think, if you take a look at Ukraine's economy, it's just a basket case. And so I assume it's simply going to muddle through over time. And I would say that from the perspective of the West, what you want to do is try to make sure that it doesn't, stumble so badly that you have continued political instability. But at the same time, you don't want to throw money at it, assuming that they'll just be able to implement reform willy-nilly. Because again, we played this game 10 years ago and it didn't work out terribly well.
Yeah. So I think the first thing is to sort of say, okay, what needs to be different or could be different from what happened 10 years ago?
Yeah.
And then second, for the West to say, okay, what is it we want? What's the best available outcome here, and what do we need to do to get there? So if I'm watching today, I'm anxious that between Russia announcing military maneuvers near Ukraine and these counter demonstrations, that is Russians signaling this Ukrainian interim government, hey, you guys aren't going to be allowed to do anything unless we like what it is, and we are perfectly comfortable with letting you be in chaos indefinitely if you want to do something that we don't like. Mm-hmm. So don't have any illusions that you can cut Ukraine loose from that, because you can't. There's not enough money in the world.
Right.
So so then you go to the Ukrainians and say, okay, go to the interim government and say, okay, so you guys, you gotta make a deal with the Russians. We can't save you from that. But what points of leverage can we help you with, and where can we get in? understanding at the same time that that's going to mean, you want access to the IMF money, you're going to have to do some really, really painful things.
Right.
And I think the question that, frankly, neither Moscow nor the West has much control over is whether out of this group of interim leadership, there arises someone who can find a way to say to Ukrainians, so we just went through a horrible, wrenching period. There's an enormous amount of division and anger in the country, and now we have to cut your energy subsidies and raise prices.
Exactly. That's if that actually happens, then I'll be convinced that what's going to happen, that there will actually be genuine change. But I think the statistic, at least when I lived in Ukraine, I believe Ukraine was the least energy efficient economy in all of Europe, and I don't think that's changed dramatically. So, in some ways, until that equation is changed, Ukraine is always going to have to deal with Russia. I'm a little more sanguine about Russia, the sort of Russian military exercises and the protests you're talking about. I don't think it's Putin indicating you can't do anything. I think it's more Putin indicating there are constraints on what you can do. You can't, and that's the signal. In other words, I think there's a recognition. Maybe this is optimistic of me, but I think there's a recognition by Moscow that the game has changed on the ground, and so while Ukraine's going to implement the policies it's going to implement, the question is, it's on the other hand not going to be a member of NATO anytime soon.
I don't think I disagree. Actually,
yeah.
I don't. No, I mean they can't. Moscow cannot and probably doesn't want to control everything that happens. But
nor, by the way, can they suddenly. And I pointed this out. They can't gin up a secessionist movement maybe in Crimea, but they can't do it in eastern Ukraine. This is not going to be a replay of what happened, let's say, in Georgia in 2008, simply because even the Russians in Ukraine, even though they identify or have friendlier attitudes towards Russia, they don't want to be part of Russia. Particularly the plutocrats that had been bankrolling Yanukovych for quite some time.
Or I would say they can gin one up, but it won't be able to accomplish much of anything other than demonstration.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's my point. Yeah. But I mean, it'll be. Let me ask you a question, because you were at the NSC, and this is one of these sort of things I wonder. This strikes me as also one of those moments where, in fact, there is some utility for contingency planning in the past. In other words, this question of when you have a country in crisis like this, the question of, well, what do you do if, in fact, you actually get a friendly government in power? What should you do at that moment? Do you have a plan on paper that obviously has to be adjusted on the fly, but at least some sort of guidelines for what you can do? Does that actually exist in the government?
So the irony is there are resources on the military side. What would we do if Russia invaded Ukraine? And there are whole windowless offices in the Pentagon of people whose job it is to spend all day and night thinking about that. There is less of a function for that on the civilian side. There's maybe two people, maybe a person at the State Department and a person at the NSC. I mean, the person at the NSC has the responsibility for strategic planning for maybe a third to a half of the world.
Right. Not to mention the fact they're also busy writing the national security strategy right now.
Right. And then there's somebody, in policy planning at the State Department whose job includes Ukraine, but that person is trying to help plan for what happens 3 months and 6 months from now. So, the short answer is no. And then the second thing is, even if there were, the contingency plan would be, let's try to do this, let's switch money from this account, and then let's go to the Hill and desperately beg. And, anytime your contingency plan includes desperately beg, it's not
a viable plan.
It's not a viable plan.
Yeah.
But the Hill has been so unwilling to give state and AID contingency funds. Mm-hmm. And what they have been able to amass over the years is so strongly focused on places that the U.S. has military commitments that, you're looking at so few resources that you might easily decide it wasn't worth the scarce staff time to develop the contingency plans that you can barely implement anyway.
On that depressing note, I think unfortunately we have to say goodbye. But But yes, let me put it this way. That's also something that I would like to see changed, in the policymaking structure. And that might be the sort of, I'd also like a pony, in the sense of that actually happening. But that's a very depressing statement about, the resiliency of U.S. foreign policymaking, I guess.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate that it's not because people are dumb or short-sighted or don't understand.
No, it's a question of resources and timing, and that we're totally that crosses party lines.
Just to loop back to where we began, actually.
Yeah. Okay.
What would be fabulous is if there were ways that academics and in general folks outside government who sort of are willing to focus on how government works, if government were able to tap that expertise, and so that people outside have thought through, well, here are the 3 things that you would do. And often, for all the reasons that we talked about at the beginning, people inside don't know that they need something until they need it. So actually, one of the most useful things that academics and think tankers and people who fund academics and think tankers can do is encourage that kind of thinking ahead, even where it hasn't been explicitly asked.
It's worth remembering, by the way, and I agree with you, and it's actually worth remembering that, people talked about how the Arab Spring, for example, and what happened in Egypt was a total blindside to the U.S. government. There was actually a task force that Brookings set up, if memory serves, that actually predicted you are going to have to deal with this. It said in the fall of 2010, but said, look out because this is going to be a problem in Egypt, come down the road. So, yes, I agree with you, and hopefully Kristof will be wrong, and there will be greater, in that sense, utility used by academics for actually creating better policy.
Okay, next time, how the State Department is like Caddyshack, or how the Treasury Department is like Caddyshack.
All right, take care, Heather.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.